All right, welcome to our lesson 2 for U.S. history. So we previously talked about Civil War, Reconstruction, westward expansion, and we're in the 1900s, 19th century. So we're talking late 1800s, we're in like the 1870s. And we're going to be talking about a new topic called the Gilded Age. So let me share my screen with you so you can see what we got going on. We're going to go to our Nearpod. So we have Unit 2, the Gilded Age. Let's go to a full screen. So the Gilded Age, what the heck is the Gilded Age? Well, it's a term coined by Mark Twain, famous American writer and novelist, satirist. And what he means by the Gilded Age was following the American Civil War, probably until about the election of Theodore Roosevelt. So probably the early 1900s, 1901. He refers to this time period as it looked really good. It was gold and gilded and shiny. It looked fantastic, this great period of American history, but underneath this gilded golden surface was a lot of rot and corruption and scandal. So that's what the Gilded Age is, 1870 to 1900. It's part of industrialization in the United States, part of the industrialization unit because America is industrializing and expanding and growing. So we're going to look at the causes and consequences of Gilded Age politics and economics. And then we're going to look a little bit at old and new immigration into the United States. So fascinating period of American history. Big concepts. So like I just mentioned, the Gilded Age was a period of political and business corruption in the United States. Why is there so much political and business corruption? Because the federal government was very, very small during the 19th century and into the 20th century. It was very small and it didn't believe in doing a whole lot. And it had this hands-off approach called laissez-faire. It's going to let things kind of be. And if we just don't really meddle with with society, if we don't really meddle with the economy, things will be better. Things will grow. And so there was a lot of economic growth. And it looked good to a lot of people. But underneath all that economic growth, there was a lot of underlying societal problems in America. And with this unprecedented industrial growth, we have factories, railroads springing up. America is becoming the #1 economy of the world. We have policies that encourage immigration. The United States wants immigrants, certain types of immigrants coming into the United States to work in these factories and to work on the railroads and of course to settle the West and farm. And so we have millions and millions and millions of Eastern and Southern Europeans flooding into the country. And we talked about Chinese immigrants flooding into the country from the West and Japanese immigrants coming. And we had immigrants coming from Mexico and other parts of the world. And all these immigrants that come to the United States following the Civil War, they're going to be called new immigrants. So all the immigrants prior to the Civil War were old immigrants. And we're going to look at the differences between the two in this lesson. And a lot of these immigrants are going to live in cities because that's where the factories are. And we're going to have this new political machine get created. And it's a machine run by these politicians who take the immigrants and they promise the immigrants their vote. If they can get the immigrants to vote for them, they make all these promises to all these immigrant groups coming into the cities, and they promise jobs and incentives if you're loyal to their party. And these political machines in most major American cities during the Gilded Age, they're run by party bosses. So Party bosses controlled most American cities during the Gilded Age, and they're these corrupt machines that control the money, the taxes, and the economic growth of the cities. And it's largely through the votes of these immigrant groups coming into these cities. So we have 14 vocab terms. So I just mentioned party boss. We're going to look at New York City. And the big political machine of New York City during the Gilded Age was Tammany Hall. And it was run by William Tweed, a native New Yorker. And he ran this big Democratic party machine, and they promised immigrants improvements to their neighborhoods and jobs if they would vote for them. And while Tweed ran and controlled the city, he was stealing millions of dollars for himself and for his friends. And it was a lot of people didn't really realize it, and a lot of people did, but they looked the other way because he was helping out a lot of people in the process of stealing. Except not everybody looked the other way. We have a lot of people who had issues with the corruption, and a lot of them were journalists. And so we have Thomas Nast. He has a big issue with William Tweed, with Boss Tweed. And Nast was a German-born immigrant. He came to the United States, and he was a great artist. And he supported Abraham Lincoln. So he supported the Republican Party, and he had issues with a lot of the corruption happening in New York City, and a lot of it was because of Boss Tweed. So he made a lot of political cartoons criticizing Tweed, and a lot of immigrants and a lot of people in New York couldn't read, but they could see these political cartoons, and it really hurt his reputation, and it's going to lead to his arrest. And Tweed's going to get arrested and put in prison for stealing. You know, like I think it's anywhere between, estimates are $40 to $200 million. Boss Tweed stole, and Nast helped expose the corruption of this big party boss. All right, let's look at a bigger. Let's look more at federal government scandals. This is involving railroads. So if you remember the first lesson, we talked a lot about the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. And these railroad companies that are building their railroad lines around the United States, they need land, because you need land to put a track. And the government was giving this land to these railroad companies to build these lines. And of course, that's going to lead to corruption, because these companies want land and people in Congress want to make money. So railroad companies start bribing members of Congress to get land. And the biggest scandal is the credit mobilier scandal, and it's connected to the Transcontinental Railroad with some of the land that's acquired. And this is just one of the scandals. There's many, many scandals that lead to the American public distrusting the government. And some of the other scandals happened during Ulysses S. Grant's presidency. But there wasn't a lot of regulation. There wasn't a lot of people, watchdogs. There were no watchdogs, nobody in government in charge of making sure other people were following the rules, and there weren't that many rules. And so one of the ways that people gained power, we talked about party bosses, well, they're part of the system, was the spoils system. And you're telling your supporters or people that want to support you, if you get me elected, I will give you a job, a government job. Even if you have absolutely no qualifications for this government job, I will give it to you if you can give me money for my campaign, or if you can get a whole bunch of people to vote for me. And that's called the spoils system. So to the victor go the spoils. That was the concept. If I get elected, I'm going to give out all these things to my supporters. And of course, that's all illegal, but that was part of the system during the Gilded Age and prior to the Gilded Age, where you win, and it still happens today. You win, I'm going to give you these different positions in the government. Now it's connected more. You can't really give positions in the government, and we're going to talk about that, but you can give people like ambassadorships around the world that help, get you elected to office. All right, so the spoils system actually leads to the death of actually a very honest president who didn't like the spoils system. It's going to lead to the assassination of James Garfield. He's another president who was a Civil War hero. Uh, there's going to be this guy named Charles Guiteau. He's like this crazy, deranged guy who felt like he deserved a job through the spoils system. And during this time period, you could walk up to the White House and you could wait at the door in line at the White House door and possibly speak to the president. And Guiteau kept going up to the White House and trying to get the president to give him a job in the post office. And Garfield's like, I don't know who you are, and I don't like the spoils system, and I'm not going to help you. So Guiteau decides that he's gonna shoot Garfield and he's gonna assassinate Garfield. Garfield's at a railway station in DC waiting to get on a train, and Guiteau comes up and shoots him in the back, and it's really terrible because Garfield gets shot. He doesn't die immediately. The bullet gets stuck in his back, and they can't get the bullet out, and he ends up getting infections. They didn't understand how germs work during this time period. People still believed, Americans, not in Europe, but in the United States, a lot of doctors still believe that you got sick from the air. I mean, just from cold and warm air. They didn't understand the concept of germs, and so Garfield gets sick, and it takes him all summer. He's in the White House suffering, and they can't get the bullet out. And you're going to watch a really great video on what happens to Garfield. They try to find the bullet and it fails, and eventually he does die, but he's going to get, his vice president's going to become president. And his vice president, who becomes president, Chester Arthur, is going to pass something called the Pendleton Act. It was very unpopular, but he got it through Congress, and he passed it. And it ended a lot of the spoils system in the federal government, and because you had to take a test, a civil service test now, to show that you had qualifications for whatever government job you were applying for. So it got rid of a lot of the offices that were given to people through the spoils system. So that's the Pendleton Act. And let's kind of shift gears about railroads. So railroads have a lot of power in the United States, and so we're going to talk a lot about the issues with railroads in this class, but railroads had a monopoly on transporting people and goods. And a lot of farmers had problems dealing with railroads because if you're out in the Midwest growing corn, or if you're raising cattle, how are you going to get those to the cities? Well, you had to put them on trains. And during this time period, trains weren't regulated, and so a lot of train companies were overcharging farmers and ranchers, and it led to the federal government's going to start regulating. So one of the first things the government's going to do to regulate industry and the railroads is the Interstate Commerce Act. It prevented railroads from developing into large monopolies where like one railroad would control all of the rail lines in an entire state, for instance. So you wouldn't want that, because in that railroad, there's no options, there's no alternative to using that railroad. You have to use them, and that's what led to a lot of misuse by these rail companies. All right, let's switch gears. Let's talk about the second half of this lesson. I'm going to talk a little bit faster because we have a lot to talk about. I mentioned new immigrants at the beginning of the lesson. So new immigrants were the immigrants who came to the United States after the Civil War, and they're mostly from Eastern and Southern Europe. So we're talking Italy, Poland, Russia, a lot of Slavic countries in Eastern Europe. And they're not going to be what most people prior to this thought of as immigrants. Most immigrants were from England and France and Germany and Scandinavia. So that Scandinavia is like Norway and Sweden, and they all had good educations, and they were able to come to the United States and start a business real easy because they had skills, and a lot of them spoke English, and a lot of them were Protestants, and they got along with most of a lot of American society. But after the Civil War, all these immigrants are going to come, and they're going to be very poor. They're going to be coming from war-torn countries where they're being persecuted. A lot of them are Jewish, so they're facing persecution in their countries for being Jewish. A lot of them are are Catholic, so they're going to be very different from the Protestant. A lot of majority of the United States is Protestant, so they're going to be, and a lot of them don't speak English. So they're going to have trouble assimilating. That's that word from last lesson. They're going to have trouble becoming like your prototypical American during the Gilded Age, and they're gonna be feel very different. They're going to end up settling in their own neighborhoods where like there'd be an Italian neighborhood where everybody spoke Italian and was Catholic and shared the same customs and food. So these immigrants are going to come in, and it's going to cause a lot of issues in the United States. And they're going to come through Ellis. If you're coming, many million, 12 million new immigrants are going to pass through Ellis Island. So that's in New York City. It's a processing facility on the eastern seaboard on the Atlantic. And if you were an Asian immigrant, you'd be passing through Angel Island, which was an island off San Francisco in California. And that's where you'd be processed. And I will say that immigrants passing through Ellis Island were treated a lot better than immigrants passing through Angel Island. But you didn't have to have, you've probably seen stories about this. We're going to watch you'll be watching a video on Ellis Island. You have to be checked medically and get processed, and you pass through, and there wasn't a lot of restrictions during this time period because immigration was encouraged. So what's bringing immigrants into the United States? There's two things you have to know: a push and a pull factor. So what's pulling immigrants to the United States? What does the United States have to offer that their home country doesn't have to offer? And so, of course, we're talking about industrialization. So we're talking about jobs. There's plenty of jobs in the United States as the United States is producing, steel and processing oil and building new things. And there's lots of jobs. And of course, there's freedom. The constitutional rights that Americans have are far better than the rights that most people have around the rest of the world during this time period. And so there's the concept of religious freedom and freedom of speech, freedom of press. That's another big driver. The feeling that if you can get to the United States, you're not going to be persecuted because you're Jewish or Catholic. And what's pushing them out of their country? So a lot of poverty and racism and violence in a lot of these poor European countries, a lot of political violence and religious violence that a lot of these Europeans are facing. So they see opportunity in the United States. So we have all these immigrants coming in, and we saw that new immigrants had trouble assimilating. And so we have a group of reformers that are going to start figuring out ways to help these new immigrants, and a lot of them are women. And we have the most important one is Jane Addams. She was a reformer who believed strongly in helping others and helping immigrants and helping children. And a lot of cities, these reformers raised money to build settlement houses. And they're kind of like community centers for people to go to get a childcare or to learn English or to take a shower or to get a meal or to help get a job. And they would go to these settlement houses, and it would help them assimilate into American society. Was one of the big goals of these settlement houses. And Jane Addams really led the way with her whole house, which was in Chicago. Now, a lot of Americans didn't want these new immigrants coming into the United States because they're so different than the old immigrants, and it leads to something called nativism. So nativism is prevalent today. There's still a lot of people that don't want immigrants coming into the United States, and during the Gilded Age, there were a lot of Americans who didn't want the new immigrants coming in, and we see political cartoons like this, the masses of Europeans getting funneled into the country, and a lot of nativists wanted Uncle Sam to kind of limit the flood of immigrants coming into the United States. So eventually the federal government's going to pass some quota laws. We'll talk about those when we get into the 1920s, where there's certain numbers, percents of how many people can come from different parts of the world. The groups that are going to face some of the worst nativist feelings will be Chinese immigrants, and that's going to be in California. Of course, we talk about how the Chinese immigrants helped build the Transcontinental Railroad. They contributed a lot to American society, but they were very, very different than Americans with European ancestry. So they looked different, they dressed different. Of course, they spoke a different language. They believed in different things. And this led to a lot of racism towards Chinese immigrants, Chinese Americans. And because of this, there's an Exclusion Act that the government passes. This will be one of the first laws that the government passes restricting immigration into the United States. And it targets Chinese immigrants. And there's a lot of violence on the West Coast towards Chinese Americans. And this leads to a lot of Chinese Americans moving to other parts of the United States. So you end up with communities all across the Midwest and the North and the South with these Chinese American communities because of they left the Western seaboard. And a lot of these new immigrants, I mentioned, they were poor and had very little skills, and they worked very, very low-paying jobs, and they lived in very crowded, unhealthy, unsafe neighborhoods in major American cities, like in New York City. And they lived in these apartments called tenements, and there were no real building codes, so tenements had no running water, no air ventilation. People lived crowded in these small apartments. So we had a reformer, kind of like Jane Addams, but approached helping immigrants in a different way. Jacob Riis was an immigrant from Denmark who came to the United States, and he wanted to document the lives of these poor immigrants. So he was a photographer. And so he took photographs of the living conditions of these immigrants. And so this is the most famous photograph that Jacob Riis has that he took, although there's hundreds, and you can look through all of them if you want to get a really great glimpse at life in the United States during the Gilded Age, but mostly people living in very squalid conditions and crowded conditions and certainly unhealthy conditions. So he put all these photographs, originally actually he took pictures and he took photographs and then he drew them, and he made this book called How the Other Half Lives. And he went around to New York City and he gave presentations to middle class and upper class New Yorkers to let them see what was going on in the slums and the poorer parts of the city so that people would want to help. And so he made this book for Americans to read so they could see what was happening. You know, there wasn't social media, there wasn't even electricity yet, and there wasn't radio, and there wasn't television, there wasn't internet. So how do you find out about what's going on? And unless you're going to go there in person, you're going to read about it, or you're going to see photographs of it. So he knew that that was the best way to reach people, to get people to become activists and to help reform these cities. And they're going to end up becoming a group called the Progressives, and we'll talk about them later in another lesson. All right, that's the end. Let's go through the timeline. So like I mentioned in the previous lesson, all of this is happening during lesson 1. So 1872 is the credit mobilier scandal. So a couple of years after the Transcontinental Railroad's finished, there's a big scandal that breaks out involving some of these companies that had helped build it, bribing Congress and whatnot with shares of their companies to get land. 1876, Boss Tweed is thrown in jail because of Thomas Nast. And you'll see what happens to Tweed in one of the videos that we're going to watch in one of the activities when he gets put in jail. 1881, Garfield is shot and later dies. 1882 is the Chinese Exclusion Act, and then in 1883 is the Pendleton Act. Remember that kind of helped end the spoils system, which led to Garfield's death. The government's going to start regulating industry a little bit here in 1887 with the Interstate Commerce Act, and in 1892 Ellis Island opens to help document the immigrants flooding into the country from Europe. So what's continuing in America during this lesson? We have immigration, we have railroads, and we have cities growing. What's going to change? What has changed by the end of this lesson? Well, we have the end of the spoil system. We do have railroads and regulation, and we have Chinese being excluded from immigrating into the United States. And that's the end of our lesson 2. And now you can move on if you've watched this, and you can do the rest of the activities associated. And I hope that you have a good day.